Okay, very happy to be here and congratulations on conducting this very pertinent, I would say, very important issues and very important timing also. And congratulations to the Gender Studies Department and Farzana and Quaid-i-Azam University. I'll try and keep my talk short because I'm not going to read the paper because I know it's the tail end of the session and I myself have to leave after the session too, so I'll just make it a bit shorter. I think following the earlier presentation, I am looking more at digging out a lot of information, knowledge, ideas, perspectives from the indigenous culture. I am now the head of Lok Virsa and looking at folklore, and I am a researcher, so things that I've been thinking about for several decades, that we need to come up with our own discourse and indigenous feminism and frameworks. So now is my best opportunity because I sit in the hub of very good archives and also a vibrant place where a lot of people, folklorists, are coming with their research. So this is a good place for me to bring other folklorists who are interested in feminism and come up with something, a whole framework. So I'm not saying this has not been developed before, but there have been attempts. Sometimes history of Muslim women and people have kind of written about what women have done in the past. So there have been attempts, and I am doing this exercise with the help of several other scholars in Pakistan. We got them all together and we spent one day, which was a wonderful day, very rich, where people shared their perspectives, and I see some people here, I know Rifat was there. So we are trying to just, it is in the process of emerging, and so it is not a hardcore framework. I will just highlight a few thematic aspects which we think are very important for us to explore more, do more research on, and then give it a more academic shape. One reason why we were very interested in exploring this was that we were getting very sick and tired of tradition or traditional culture as a beating stick. And I know that patriarchy is a part of culture, not just South Asian, but internationally also. However, when we look at our traditional culture, it is not always suppression and discrimination and violence against women. There is much more in terms of open spaces, progressive spaces, empowerment. But the way the narrative, the common narrative, or especially that related to media and even sometimes our creative arts, is focused on, if you beat your wife, that is traditional. If you cut up your sister, that is traditional. Honor killing, traditional. So it's like whenever you want to say stop the suppression of women or something, they say, the tradition, the tradition, the tradition. So that we were very tired of that sortie because we felt that we have allowed even this space to them to define and to redefine and make it legitimate, make the suppression and discriminate legitimate by using the word tradition. So it was just, these were not very defined thoughts, but this was the direction we want to go and just explore and come up with things that were progressive so that the tradition is seen more balanced and women can actually legitimize a lot of positive spaces and empowerment and take the evidence from the tradition also rather than leaving the whole space to the other narrative. So that was the general direction. And so we started talking about positive role models in our traditional culture and folklore. And I have been actually working on Heer as a role model for almost a year and a half now, and have had several programs, seminars, music programs around Heer, exploring the dimensions of a personality. And I think Heer, like many other characters in folk epics, is somebody that we cannot really, there is no controversy about her that she's not traditional. She is 100% traditional. In general, people will consider Heer Ranja, Sasi Punnu as very traditional folkloric epics. So what Heer is a symbol of taking charge of her life, making decisions, um, taking up her own family, taking on her own family, taking on her community, taking on the conservatism in those days, taking on the Qazi and taking on the Raja. And so in that way, she was a fighter, and in a way that she was not remembered as a fighter. She is remembered with a lot of compassion. She is remembered as somebody who is very positive. So much so that the story of Heer and Ranja is called Heer and not Heer and Ranja. And when you're reciting, you say you're singing Heer. And the mazar, which is supposedly of Heer and Ranja, nobody says ki I'm going to the mazar of Heer and Ranja or doing a mannat for Heer and Ranja. They say we are going to my Heers. So she was so dominant in that whole story and so dominant in Punjabi folklore that people respect her and people do not have any controversial stories about her. So she's kind of an accepted, positive and very folkloric character. So we started exploring Heer, and then we started exploring other women. I'm just picking one example, but there are other women in many of the folk tales where they took charge and they made their own decision, and people were with her as opposed to the opposition that they faced. And we thought that writing more about these things and doing more research about these things would probably help us reclaim some of that space that we should reclaim in the folklore. Another aspect that we thought was very important is the whole area of mysticism and Sufi literature. And there also, when we explored more, and that has been researched and written about by other scholars also, but we were looking at it more in the framework context, how Sufis depicted women and how Sufis considered women to be sort of the epitome of compassion and love, and that is why they refer to themselves as women at times, because of the intensity of love and compassion. And how, for example, Shah Latif, how he has labeled all the chapters of his writings with the name of women. So the chapters are titled with 7 different names of women. And then the stories of these women too. So Mobeen is something I've discussed in this informal paper that I wrote. A woman who was not unlike Heer. She was earlier stigmatized a little bit because she used to invite men into her big dream castle, and then she was a little hypocrite, and her whole palace was called like a chakla, like she was a prostitute. And with Shah Latif's poetry, he totally transforms her and tells the whole story as to how she was trying to get back at somebody who had a whole like fraudulent thing with her father, and she was trying to find that person, and then giving it a mystical element where she was looking for love and she finds her love. So suddenly Mobeen's status was raised, and Mobeen became a kind of a deeper story of women, and with a very different angle, very different perspective too. So we kind of looked at how Sufis not only presented women as the characters of their stories and their poetry, and related to their pain, compassion, but they also gave a very different perspective on local understanding of what women were doing. Another aspect we looked at was how history, even a folklore, the history sort of turns the stories into very biased perspective, and because we ourselves are not writing folklore and propagating that, our perspectives are lost. So we looked at leadership and political struggle of women and saw what was documented, how it was documented, and how there were big gaps in terms of, like one example we were talking about was Fatma Jinnah's, that we have always seen her grey-haired in white garara in her old age. Actually, I don't even remember seeing a younger Fatma Jinnah ever in our books. So we have this two-dimensional picture that we see hanging on the walls or in slideshows, and younger people, we talk to younger people as part of this exercise, and most of the people, almost all the people we talked to, younger people, did not know that she was a dentist, and she had her own practice, and she was living by herself in another city away from her office, away from her family. So this is just a very small example. I'm not kind of making a big deal out of it, but it is common to have a few women leaders and a two-dimensional view of them, and not really get a three-dimensional, four-dimensional person and relate to them. And of course there is a gap of so many women who are totally invisible in the record of our past. Then another theme that we talked about was progressive spaces, and we looked at how the society was giving a lot of spaces for women to connect, progressive or not, but to connect, to bond, to learn, to be aware of what is going on. For example, at a tandoor, they would bring their atta and their peras in their barats, and they will all come and sit together, and there they could sit for hours or a long time. And as the tandoor wali, who used to be a woman, would bake their bread, and they would just sit around and talk, like a well also, when they would go to get water or washing clothes, or there are many taranjan, which was like when they would take their cotton and their wheels, spinning wheels, all at one place, and then they used to spin thread together. That was called taranjan. So there were many places like that, even dholaks, at the weddings, 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the weddings, that was their time after dinner, after finishing up their chores. So we looked at those spaces, and we tried to figure out what has happened to those spaces now. Of course, times change, traditions change, narratives change, but then just to kind of focus on the transformation, have other spaces replace them, or those have withered away. So we looked at, for fun, we were looking at Facebook and social media and making comments. This is just an area we are identified to be explored more, but we were noticing that a lot of women now use, I'm talking about Pakistan more, use Facebook and Twitter, but you do see a very strong trend of putting a cat face or a butterfly or a flower petal, instead of their profile picture. And there needs to be a lot of exploration and research to find out what is happening to these spaces. Are we still not considering them legitimate or not? Again, no conclusions. I'm just kind of identifying areas for study. Then I'll take my last point first. We looked at the material culture and what it says about women, what kind of history, what kind of folkloric tradition it expresses in terms of our clothing, in terms of the use of color, in terms of embroideries, in terms of pottery work and the meenakari and the lacquer, and not just the beautiful crafts, but however women have been using material culture, and in a way it has reflected the lives of women. So that is another way where we need to deepen our perspectives of how material culture has played a role in their lives and how they have expressed either their resistance or their pain through that. Because I think that a lot needs to be desired in terms of our own research in these areas. So my last point or last thematic area is creative expression and performing arts, because that we were quite, it was a complicated process even in our initial discussions, because we are seeing the number of women singers going down, the numbers of, other than media anchors or maybe in the news, electronic media, where the number of women is growing. All the older traditional creative expressions, we are noticing that the number of women is going down very fast. And the stigma attached to women especially, the stigma is attached in our society or South Asian culture. In general, I'll make a statement that there is stigma for creativity, but for women it has grown. That is the trend. It is not a conclusion, but a trend that is observed. Because as part of this folklore institute that I head, I have really started a whole talent hunt for younger girls who are interested in singing. Dancing is kind of withered away, it seems, altogether. But just to encourage, because it is almost getting to an extent of extinction. Dancing is really going out of our lives very fast. So, study of that, why the stigma is, if it is becoming higher, and what is happening with women and the creative expression in this whole area, and what do they actually experience, and the norms of the society. So that these were like 4 areas that we as a group identified in our exercise, and with the intention of just outlining the beginning of developing a framework. And we felt that since there is so much criticism, and this was not the main reason for it, but I'm just mentioning as one of the factors, that there was so much criticism of tradition, which is supposedly ours, being bad, and anything good in feminism being very Western, and so both times we get a slap, both sides on our face. Tradition, that is bad. Anything positive, that is very Western, and we all, of course, are delegitimized for that also. So several of us are thinking more and more in terms of exploring the indigenous feminism and doing research in these aspects, at least collecting knowledge and creating knowledge and having narratives and having perspectives and research materials for our own gender studies students, which are based or rooted in South Asia. And over the years or over the decades, the change in the perspectives, just like we do any other study of a region, we should have our own and see how feminism has changed over the years, how definitions have changed, how priorities have changed, how perspectives have changed, and at some point theorize that. Thank you very much.